There was a Sunday morning, I don't remember exactly which one, where everything went quiet before I meant for it to. I was sitting in my chair by the window, the chair I've sat in every Sunday morning for close to 40 years. The light was coming in the way it does in early spring, that pale, thin kind of light that doesn't quite warm anything yet. I had my coffee. I had my Bible open on my knee, and I was about to do what I always did. Lower my head, close my eyes, and start talking to God. But something stopped me. Not a voice. Not a thought I could name. Just a pause. A second or two of absolute stillness where my mouth was open and nothing came out. The words I'd been saying my entire adult life. The same words, the same shape, the same direction. They just didn't come. I sat there with that silence for longer than was comfortable. The coffee was getting cold. The light was shifting slightly against the wall. And I just sat there, Bible open, hands resting on the pages, not praying, not quite thinking, just existing in a strange, suspended moment that I couldn't explain then and couldn't fully explain for years afterward. And then, because I didn't know what else to do, I opened my eyes and looked at the page. The passage I had opened to was in Deuteronomy. I hadn't chosen it deliberately. It was just where the book fell. I read it the way I'd read it dozens of times, scanning the familiar words, looking for something to hold on to. The way you do when you're not sure what you're looking for, but you can feel the absence of it. I didn't find it that morning. I closed the Bible. I finished the coffee. I got ready for church. But something had changed in that silence. Something I wouldn't be able to name for a long time. I didn't know, sitting there that morning, that within 2 years I'd be a different person. I didn't know that a question I hadn't thought to ask yet was already forming somewhere underneath the surface. I didn't know that the God I was about to pray to, the one I'd prayed to for 50 years, had a name that was only part of the story. If you've ever had a moment like that, you know what I mean. The pause before the prayer. The second where something in you hesitates, and you don't know why yet. Where the words you've always said feel suddenly strange in your mouth, like a word you've repeated so many times it stops sounding like itself. Stay with me on this, because what I found out later explains that pause better than I ever could have explained it myself. Before I continue, if this kind of conversation is something you've been looking for, it's worth clicking subscribe. The way YouTube works, the algorithm only keeps bringing you this kind of content if you tell it you want more, and I have a lot more of these stories to tell. Okay, let's go. I want to tell you about a place you've probably never heard of. A site in the desert of the northern Sinai. A crossroads between ancient Judah and the trade routes leading south. Archaeologists call it Kuntillet Ajrud. They found it in the 1970s. And what they found there, sitting on broken pieces of large ceramic storage jars from the 8th century before the Common Era, were inscriptions, written in ancient Hebrew. Formal blessing formulas, the kind of language you'd use if you were a scribe, or a priest, or someone with religious authority. Not casual graffiti, not the desperate scrawl of someone in hiding. Formal, deliberate, official language, the kind of language that gets used at the official religious sites of a civilization. And one of them said this: I bless you by YHWH and his Asherah. The name of God, the God of the Bible, the God of Abraham and Moses and the Shema. The Lord our God, the Lord is one. That God and his Asherah. His. I want you to feel the weight of that word. His. As in, belonging to him? As in, a companion? As in, someone paired with him so naturally, so assumed that the scribe who wrote this blessing formula didn't even hesitate. The pairing was not controversial, It was not heretical. It was the way things were. Now, here's the thing I need you to understand before we go any further. When I first read those words, I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel vindicated. I didn't feel like I'd caught anyone in a lie. What I felt, sitting at a table in the Knoxville Public Library with a photocopy of a journal article in front of me, what I felt was something much quieter and much heavier than that. I felt like I was looking at a photograph of something that had been erased. Not hidden in a locked room somewhere, waiting to be discovered by the right person with the right clearance. Erased. Methodically. Over centuries. In the kind of slow, systematic way that leaves almost no trace, except for a broken storage jar in a desert crossroads, baked hard enough by 3,000 years of sun to survive until 1975. Asherah was a goddess, one of the most important figures in the ancient Canaanite world, the divine feminine, the mother of the gods, the consort of the Most High. Her worship was everywhere in the ancient Near East. Her symbols, the sacred tree, the carved wooden pole, appeared throughout ancient Israel, not as fringe heresy, not as the practice of some isolated pagan community that had nothing to do with real Israelites. At official religious sites, used alongside the name of YHWH, found in the temple in Jerusalem itself, if you read carefully enough, before the Reform stripped her out. That's not my interpretation. That's what the archaeology says. Zeev Meshel, who led the excavation at Kuntillet Ajrud, documented it. William G. Deaver, one of the most respected biblical archaeologists of the 20th century, spent decades arguing from the evidence that everyday Israelite religious practice included Asherah as a consort figure alongside YHWH. His book, Did God Have a Wife?, is not a provocative title. It's a sincere question answered by the ground itself. Dever spent years looking at what ordinary Israelites actually left behind. Not the official texts, not the theology of the ruling class, the household figurines, the amulets, the small clay objects found in domestic spaces across Israel, figurines of a female figure with her arms supporting her breasts, the universal pose of a fertility goddess across the ancient Near East. These weren't found in one or two locations. They were found everywhere. In homes, in storage rooms, in graves, in places where ordinary people, farmers, merchants, mothers, fathers, kept the things that mattered to them. She was there, not as a rival to YHWH, not as a competing theology held by a splinter group. As his partner, as the divine feminine half of a religious reality that ordinary Israelites understood as natural, as given as simply the way the world was ordered. But none of this is what stopped me in the library that afternoon. What stopped me was something else, something that happened when I put down the journal article and picked up my Bible. I turned to Deuteronomy, chapter 32, verses 8 and 9. The same passage I had opened to that Sunday morning with the pale light. A passage I had read dozens of times. A passage I had taught in Sunday school. Used it, actually, to talk about God's special relationship with Israel, His chosen people. A passage that, in the Bible I had grown up with, the standard Masoretic text, the one used by most English translations, reads, "When the Most High gave the nations their inheritance, when He divided all mankind, He set up boundaries for the peoples according to the number of the sons of Israel." Sons of Israel. I'd read that 100 times. Never thought to question it, but the oldest surviving copies of the text, the Dead Sea Scrolls, the ancient Greek Septuagint, they don't say sons of Israel. They say sons of God, or in some places, sons of El. Think about what that means for a moment. Sit with it. The Most High divided the nations according to the number of the sons of God, and then the Lord, YHWH, received Israel as His own portion, His own allotted inheritance, parceled out among a divine council. That language, the Most High, separate from YHWH, dividing the nations and assigning them to different gods. That language only makes sense inside a world where there were multiple gods, where YHWH was not the only god, but a god, the god assigned to Israel. One of many, each with their own allotted people, a divine bureaucracy. And somewhere between that ancient text and the Bible sitting on my chair by the window, someone made a choice. They changed sons of God to sons of Israel. They didn't eliminate the passage. They adjusted it. Just enough to smooth the surface. Just enough that a person reading it in church or in Sunday school or alone in an armchair on a quiet Sunday morning would never feel the texture of what was underneath. 4 words. That's all it took. 4 words replaced by 3 words, and the entire theological framework of the verse shifts from a divine council of many gods to a single God choosing his people. 4 words. And I had read that passage 100 times without ever knowing. Now here's what I need you to really hear, because this is the part that took me the longest to name. I'm not angry that I was wrong. I've been wrong about plenty of things in 67 years. I know what it feels like to update a belief, to sit with new information and let it rearrange something inside you. That kind of wrong I can live with. In 35 years of teaching history, I updated my understanding of events, of causation, of context, probably hundreds of times. That's what intellectual life is supposed to be. What I couldn't live with, what I still on certain evenings find myself sitting with, is the silence. The specific, deliberate silence of people who knew. I need you to understand the shape of this, because it matters. This is not like finding out that scientists discovered something new that contradicts old religious ideas. This is not a case of ancient people not having access to modern knowledge. The scholars who study this material, the professors in the seminaries, the trained academics who teach at divinity schools across this country, they have known about Kuntillet Ajrud since the 1970s. The inscriptions have been published. The debate has been in the journals. Dever's book came out in 2005. This is not hidden knowledge. It is not controversial within the field. And yet, I attended a continuing education seminar at a Baptist seminary near Knoxville. This was years before I retired. A visiting professor was talking about ancient religious practices in Canaan. He was a careful man. You could tell he'd spent decades in the sources. The way he referenced texts came too easily to be performed, the kind of offhand citation that only happens when a person has lived inside material for a long time. He mentioned in passing that there were certain overlaps between Canaanite religion and early Israelite practice. He said it the way you'd say something you weren't quite sure you were allowed to say in that room. Quickly, without elaboration. His eyes didn't quite meet the audience when he said it. And then he moved on, back to something safer. Something the room could receive without shifting in their seats. I remember the pause in the room after he said it. That particular quality of silence that isn't quite listening and isn't quite dismissal. It's the silence of a room that has collectively decided not to pick up what's been put down. Not one question, not one raised hand. And I didn't raise mine either. I didn't know enough yet to know what I didn't know. He never returned to it. Not in that session. Not in any session I attended after. I've wondered about him since. Not with anger, exactly. With something more like recognition. He knew. He'd spent a career knowing. And he had sat in that room. A room full of people who were going to go back to their congregations and teach from the same texts he was teaching from. And said exactly one sentence, a sentence small enough to be ignored. I wonder sometimes whether he lay awake that night, thinking about it, whether he'd made that calculation, the one between truth and consequence, and arrived, after years of practice, at a single sentence that was technically accurate and practically useless. And I never heard it raised from a pulpit. Not once. In 22 years as a deacon, leading adult Sunday school, sitting through hundreds of sermons, not once did anyone stand up and say, "By the way, the text you are reading is the result of a long, deliberate process of editing. The God you are praying to was once one among many. His consort was named. Her name was removed." Not once. That's the thing about silence. It doesn't feel like deception when you're inside it. It just feels like the truth having no edges, like the world being exactly the shape you were told it was. You don't know what hasn't been said. You don't know the shape of the absence. The silence feels like completion. You know exactly what I'm talking about, because you felt that too. Maybe not about this, maybe about something else entirely, but there's a specific feeling, and it's different from just being lied to. When you realize that the people who shaped what you believed had access to the full picture and chose what to show you. It's not quite betrayal. It's something more like the floor dropping half an inch. Just enough that you notice. Just enough that you realize the floor you were standing on wasn't solid ground. It was suspended, and it was someone else's hand holding it up. And that hand had reasons you were never given the chance to evaluate. And nobody warned me about that feeling. Nobody tells you about this part. Not the moment of disbelief, not the first crack in the wall, but the specific loneliness of realizing that the silence was kept by people who had taken a vow, who had, in some cases, dedicated their entire professional lives to passing on knowledge of these texts. Who knew, in whatever form they could articulate it, that the story was more complicated than the version they were teaching? Who had read Dever or Meshel or the journal articles or the Dead Sea Scrolls scholarship, and who had come to some private reckoning with what that meant, and then walked back into their congregations and kept teaching from the Masoretic text without a footnote. And they chose the version. I don't know why. I've thought about it for a long time. Fear, probably. The fear of what happens when you tell a congregation that their faith has a history. That monotheism was not a revelation that arrived fully formed from the sky, but a process. A long, contested, politically shaped process. The fear of watching 50 people in folding chairs look at you differently. The fear of phone calls to the deacon board. The fear of what it does to a community when the ground shifts. That the reforming religious elites who standardized the text we read, the priests behind what scholars call the Deuteronomistic reform, the movement that produced the book of Deuteronomy, and then revised much of Israel's history through that lens, that those people made choices, deliberate, consequential choices about which gods were acceptable and which had to be erased. And Asherah had to be erased. Her trees were cut down. Her poles were removed from the temple. Her figurines were, in certain periods, actively suppressed, though they kept showing up in people's homes long after the official religion said they shouldn't be there. The reformers who wrote her out of the story were the same people shaping the text that became the Bible. And they did it systematically enough that 30 centuries later, a retired history teacher in East Tennessee could read the same passages they edited without knowing he was reading an edited version. I taught history for 35 years. I taught my students every year in every class that the first question a good historian asks is, what does the earliest evidence actually say? Not what we were told, not what tradition assumes. What does the earliest surviving record say? I never once turned that question on my own scripture. I'm not proud of that, but I understand why. When something is not framed as history, when it's framed as truth, the historian's instinct doesn't activate. You're not taught to interrogate it. You're taught to receive it. And I received it alongside everything else I was. My marriage, my friendships, my place in the community, my role as a deacon, my Sunday mornings in the chair by the window. It was woven into the fabric of who I was in a way that made questioning it feel less like intellectual inquiry and more like dismantling the house you live in. And for 50 years, I received it. Millions of people received it. In Baptist churches in Tennessee and Methodist churches in Ohio and evangelical congregations across the entire English-speaking world. Millions of people were handed a version of God that had been through an editing process they were never told about. A version with a consort removed. A version where the divine counsel had been papered over. A version where the phrase, "Sons of God," had been quietly replaced with "Sons of Israel." A version where the texture of the original, the plural, contested, politically shaped original, had been smoothed until it felt like truth. You didn't receive the original. None of us did. And that's not your fault. Let me say that again, because it's the thing I needed someone to tell me and nobody did. The fact that you prayed to a version of God that was given to you by people who shaped the text is not a failure of your faith. It's not evidence that you were naive. It's not something to be ashamed of. You believed what you were given. You prayed as sincerely as any human being has ever prayed. The depth of your faith was real. The sincerity of it was real. The hope inside it was real. The problem wasn't you. The problem was that somebody decided which version of the story you deserved to know. And that decision was made without your consent, without your knowledge, long before you were born, long before your parents were born, long before any of the people who taught you were born. It was made by people who had their own reasons, their own fears, their own sense of what the world needed to believe. And those reasons became the bedrock of a tradition that reached across 3,000 years and landed in your lap, as if it had always been exactly this shape. There's a word for what happened here. Scholars who study this process call it the Deuteronomistic reform, the systematic editing of Israel's religious history to align with a strict monotheism that may not have been the original practice of the people who wrote the earliest texts. Othmar Keel and Christoph Uehlinger spent years documenting the iconographic record, the images, the seals, the figurines, the archaeological residue of what ordinary Israelites actually worshipped. And what they found was not one God and one faith from the beginning. They found a plural devotional landscape. Multiple divine figures. A goddess who stood beside the God of Israel in everyday practice. And then they found the place where she disappears. Not all at once, gradually. The reform didn't happen overnight. It was a process of centuries. Kings, priests, scribes working together to enforce a religious standard that the people themselves hadn't originally held. The reforms under Josiah in the late 7th century before the Common Era, documented in 2 Kings, interestingly enough, in a text that was itself probably shaped by the reformers, describe a systematic purge, Asherah poles removed, altars destroyed, the worship of other gods officially prohibited. And the text we have, the Bible you held in your hands, the Bible I held in my hands, is the product of that process. Not a snapshot of ancient Israelite religion as it actually existed. A curated version. An edited version. The version the reformers wanted to survive. Alice Mandel, a scholar who studied the Kuntillet Ajrud inscriptions specifically, argued that these weren't fringe inscriptions. They weren't the desperate prayers of some heretic in a cave. They were formal blessing formulas, the kind of language used in official religious contexts, the kind of thing a trained scribe would write at a waystation used by priests and officials traveling between Judah and the Sinai trade routes, which means that pairing YHWH with his Asherah wasn't a fringe act. It was normal. It was ordinary devotional life. It was what you did when you wanted to bless someone in the name of the divine. And then it was made to disappear. Now I want to stop here for a moment, because I know what some of you are thinking. And I want to meet that thought directly, because it's a fair objection and it deserves a real answer. Some scholars argue that the word Asherah in these inscriptions is just a common noun, referring to a cultic pole or a sacred tree symbol, not the goddess herself. And that argument has linguistic support. The word can function as a common noun in ancient Hebrew. The grammar is real. But here's what that argument misses. That wooden pole, that sacred tree. It was the recognized symbol of the goddess Asherah. That's what it meant. That's what everyone who encountered it understood. The same way the cross is a symbol, but it's not just two pieces of wood. It's a whole theological world embodied in an object. Calling it just an object doesn't remove the reality the object represents. And the goddess behind the Asherah pole was not a minor local deity. She was one of the central figures of the ancient Canaanite religious world. Her symbol being present at Israelite religious sites, that's not a coincidence of carpentry, that's her worship. There's also the grammatical argument that a proper divine name in ancient Hebrew doesn't normally take a possessive suffix. His Asherah. That's unusual, real, worth noting honestly. But most scholars who have studied this answer it by pointing to what they call the hypostasis pattern, the idea that a suffixed form refers to the goddess's localized cultic presence or manifestation at a specific site. A linguistic nuance, not proof her worship was absent. Either way, whether you read it as the goddess herself or as her localized cultic presence, the inscription tells the same story. Ordinary religious life in ancient Israel included her, paired with YHWH, in a way that felt completely natural to the people living it. The archaeological record of consistent Asherah symbols at Israelite religious sites tells the same story, independent of any single inscription. She was there, in one form or another, and then she wasn't. I've been sitting with that for years now. The strangeness of it. The specific strangeness of being someone who cares deeply about what is true, who spent his career teaching students to ask hard questions about primary sources, and realizing that the most foundational text in his own life, the one he had taught from, prayed from, built his identity on, was a text he'd never actually interrogated. Not because he couldn't, but because nobody ever suggested he should. The history teacher who checked the primary sources on everything else, who taught students to ask about author, audience, purpose, context, who spent 35 years insisting that the first question about any document is who wrote it, for whom, and why. That man never once asked those questions about the Bible sitting on his knee. That particular blindness took me a long time to forgive in myself. I'm still working on it, honestly. That's the thing that still gets me on quiet evenings. Not the theology. Not even the question of whether God exists or what God might be if God does exist. Those are questions I'm at peace with not fully answering. I'm 67 years old, and I've made my peace with uncertainty. What gets me is the system. The way it was designed so that the questions never arrive. The way the Sunday school curriculum is structured so that the historical context never quite shows up. The way the sermons circle the same passages year after year and never once land on the textual variants. The way a seminary professor can mention Canaanite religious overlap in a single sentence and then move on, and the entire room lets him, because the room has been trained to let those moments pass. I think about that professor sometimes, the one who mentioned it in passing. I wonder what he knew. I wonder what he'd read in whatever long academic career had brought him to that room, about Asherah and the inscriptions and the editorial process that produced the text we call the Bible. I wonder if he wanted to say more. If there was a version of that sentence that was twice as long, and he stopped himself halfway through. If he had, at some point in his career, made the choice to keep one foot inside the institution, because the institution was his livelihood, his community, his life. And that choice meant keeping certain doors closed, or at least very slightly ajar. I'll never know. He moved on. I let him. And I went home and sat in my chair and opened my Bible and kept praying to the same God I'd always prayed to, the same version, the one handed to me by people who had made choices I wasn't told about. For years after that seminar, actually. I kept praying. Because I didn't have the vocabulary yet for what I'd glimpsed, because having a half-formed question and having the tools to actually pursue it are two very different things. The question had landed somewhere in me, but without the right framework, it just sat there, unprocessed, like hearing a word in a language you don't speak yet. You know you heard something, but you can't do anything with it. And because when your whole life is structured around a set of beliefs, the first instinct, even for a history teacher, even for someone trained in critical thinking, is to find a way to make the evidence fit the framework, not to let the evidence reshape the framework. That instinct is not stupidity. I want to be very clear about that. It's not naivety. It's the way human beings survive inside communities. You don't question the foundation of the house while you're living in it. Not if the house is also where your friends are, where your sense of self is, where your marriage was, where your grief is, where every Sunday morning of your life has taken place. You do what humans do. You find ways to absorb dissonance without letting it collapse the whole structure. Until one day, you can't. It takes time, and it takes someone putting the right question in front of you in a form you can't quite dismiss. For me, that question arrived in a photocopy of a journal article about ancient ceramic inscriptions in the Sinai desert. Maybe for you, it arrived differently. Maybe it arrived in a book a friend gave you, or a video that showed up in your feed at 2 a.m, or a conversation you had with someone you trusted that ended in a question neither of you could answer. Maybe it arrived slowly, over years, the way the tide comes in. So gradually you didn't notice the shore changing until one day you looked up and the landscape was completely different. Maybe you're in the middle of it right now. Not at the end. Not at the beginning. In the middle, where it's the hardest, where you've seen enough to know you can't go back, but you haven't gotten far enough forward to see what's on the other side. However it arrived, you're here now. And I want to say something directly to you because it's something nobody said to me until much too late. What you're feeling, that specific mix of grief and anger and something that isn't quite betrayal but is adjacent to it, that's not a sign that something went wrong with you. That's the weight of discovering that the version of the story you were given was a curated version, chosen for you, shaped by hands and agendas you were never introduced to. The grief is appropriate, the anger is appropriate, even the confusion is appropriate. All of it is the correct response to finding out that the map you were given doesn't match the territory. That feeling has a name, actually. Marlene Winell, a psychologist who has spent decades working with people leaving high-control religious environments. She calls it religious trauma. Not a metaphor, not a casual usage, a clinical reality. The grief of losing a framework that organized your entire world, combined with the specific anger of realizing that the framework was maintained in part by the silence of people who could have said something. People who knew, people who chose the version. And it's not just about the information, it's about what the silence cost you. Think about all the times you prayed in a moment of real need, really praying, the way you pray when you have nowhere else to go. And you were reaching towards something that was, in some way, you couldn't articulate, more complicated than the simple, singular, purely monotheistic God you had been handed. The ancient Israelites who wrote those blessing formulas at Kuntillet Ajrud were also reaching towards something that included a feminine face, something that included partnership, something that understood the divine as more than one, more than masculine, more complete. That was edited out of what you received. I'm not saying the God you prayed to wasn't real to you. I know the God I prayed to was real to me. The experience of prayer was real. The comfort was real. The sense of being heard sometimes was real. I'm not here to take that from you or to tell you what to conclude from any of this. But I do want to say, the the version you were given was impoverished in ways you weren't told about. Someone decided 3,000 years ago, and again in the editing process that followed, that you would receive a God without a consort, a God who stood alone, a God whose origins in a larger divine world had been smoothed away. And that decision was made without your knowledge or consent, by people who had their reasons, in a time and context you were never introduced to. You weren't supposed to find out this way. Nobody sat you down and said, here is the full picture. Here are the things we know and the things we don't. Here are the editorial decisions that produced the text you're about to receive. You were handed the finished product and told it was the original. And for a very long time, probably. That was fine, because the version you were given was beautiful in its way. It organized the world. It gave you language for suffering and hope and community and purpose. I know what that felt like, because I lived inside it for 50 years. I know the particular warmth of a congregation that has known you for decades. I know what it feels like to sit in a church building on a Sunday morning and feel like you belong to something larger than yourself. I know the comfort of a faith that tells you grief has meaning, that loss is not the end, that the people you love are somewhere. I know all of that, but you can't unknow what you've learned. And here's the other thing I've learned, the thing I didn't expect. Unknowing is not the same as losing. When I found out about Asherah, I didn't lose God, or whatever God is. What I lost was a particular version of the story, a version that had been handed to me by people who thought they knew better than to give me the whole thing. And once I understood that the version I'd been given was a version, one among several, shaped by historical forces I can now actually study, something strange happened. The silence stopped feeling like peace and started feeling like a room I could finally see the walls of. I could see where the text had been smoothed, where a passage had been adjusted, where a goddess had been removed. I could see the seams, and seeing the seams, as disorienting as that was, as much as it cost me, it meant I was finally reading the actual document instead of the document I'd been told I was reading. That's not nothing. That's actually something. And seeing the seams doesn't destroy the cloth. It just changes what the cloth is. What? It becomes a human thing, something made by human hands over centuries by people with beliefs and agendas and fears and hopes, instead of a divine thing that descended fully formed from above. And a human thing can still be beautiful. A human thing can still carry wisdom. A human thing can still be worth reading, worth sitting with, worth wrestling with. It just has to be read as what it is. That change is irreversible, I know that. Once you see it, you don't unsee it, but irreversible isn't the same as catastrophic. Now, I need to pause here for just a moment, because this kind of content, the research, the digging, the conversations that happen in the comments below, the community that forms around this specific kind of honesty, none of it sustains itself without support. If these conversations are meaningful to you, the super thanks button below this video is a direct way to make sure more of them happen. It's not a small thing. The work that goes into this, the research, the writing, the years of sitting with these questions before I was ready to say any of it out loud, that work is what you're supporting. And I'm genuinely grateful for every person who does. Go back for a moment to that chair by the window, the pale spring light, the coffee going cold, the Bible open on my knee, the pause before the prayer. I've thought about that pause many times since, about what it was, what it knew that I didn't know yet, because it didn't feel like doubt exactly. It felt like something in me knew before my mind did, knew that the words I was about to say were reaching toward something I didn't fully understand yet, that the shape of the prayer, the direction of it, the address of it, the theology embedded in every syllable, was built on a version of the story that had more history behind it than I had ever been allowed to see. Knew, maybe, that the God I was addressing had once had a name that included her, that the silence around her name was itself a kind of loss. My body knew before my head did. That pause wasn't a failure. It wasn't weakness. It wasn't a crack in my faith. It was the first honest moment in a long time. The moment before the words came, before I filled the silence with the familiar, before I reached for the version I'd been given. That pause was the truest thing I did that whole Sunday. Whatever you're carrying right now, whatever question arrived in your life and rearranged things, I want you to hear this. The problem was never your faith, the depth of your belief, the sincerity with which you prayed, the years you gave to a community and a framework. None of that was wrong. What was wrong was that somebody made a choice about what you deserved to know, and they made it quietly, and they kept it quietly, and they kept it that way for centuries. You were praying as hard as any human being has ever prayed. You were just praying to a version of the story that had been through an editing room you were never shown. That's not your fault. You deserved the full picture. Everybody does. Now, before we close, I want to ask you something. Because if you've watched this far, you've sat with this for a while. And sitting with this means you probably have a thought. Something this landed on, something it confirmed, something it complicated. There's a question I keep coming back to, and I want to know if you've ever asked it yourself. When was the first moment you realized that what you'd been taught was a version? Not the truth, but a version of the story. Not the moment you stopped believing. The moment you realized someone had made a choice about what you would be allowed to know. The moment the floor dropped that half-inch. Write it in the comments. You don't have to name names. You don't have to have it figured out. You don't have to know where you stand now on any of the big questions. Just write it. Because someone else is going to read it and feel for the first time that they are not alone in this. And that's the whole point. That's always been the whole point. There's also a link in the description to the Spinoza Forever Library. 5 volumes that go much deeper into the textual history, the archaeology, and the emotional territory we've been covering in this channel. If you've been watching for a while and want something to hold, something to take off the shelf when the questions get loud, something to read in the chair by your own window, that's what it's there for. Make of that what you will, and I'll see you in the next one.